I have been doing sermons of the book of Romans, expository sermons. And now we come to Romans chapter 1, verse 18 to chapter 3, verse 20. Paul is going to set forth the need of justification and God's righteousness. He's going to put the MRI, so to speak, on all humanity, on everyone, that all have sinned and are falling short of the glory of God. And that's why there's the need of God's righteousness. So Paul begins with that. And in chapter 1, verse 18 to chapter 1, verse 31, he is addressing the guilt of Gentiles. In chapter 2, he'll talk about the guilt of the Jews under the law. And then in chapter 3, he'll conclude with a long string of biblical texts showing that everyone is falling short of God's glory and therefore is in need of his righteousness. So I'd like to pick up in verse 18 now. We've looked at the introduction, salutation, I should say, and Paul's desire to go to Rome, and the theme of the power of the gospel in verses 16 and 17. Now we come to the guilt of humankind. And we begin, I'll be translating in my sermon from the Greek text and then simply making application or interpretation, I should say, seeking to track Paul's thought through this great text. It begins, "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who are holding down or suppressing the truth in unrighteousness." We begin with the revelation of God's wrath. And I think this could be a futuristic use of the verb here, for the wrath of God is being revealed, meaning it's about to be revealed. It's a present passive tense, but I think it has a futuristic meaning, looking at the final judgment that the Lord is bringing. Paul has us in a courtroom, and God is the prosecuting attorney, so to speak. And this is what we call a reeve, a courtroom scene. And so we're going to see the guilt, first of all, of the Gentile world. And the reason for this guilt is they're suppressing the truth of natural revelation, Paul's going to argue, because that which is known of God is manifest among them, for God has manifested it to them. God has revealed to all mankind his eternal power and Godhead. Paul goes on to explain, "For the unseen things of him," or his unseen things, "by the creation of the world are being clearly perceived, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and divinity, so that they are without excuse." What Paul's saying is God has revealed himself in nature so that everyone looking at it is without excuse. He has shown his divinity. He has shown his Godhead, his sovereignty. This is what Paul's saying. But he goes on to say, because knowing God, they did not glorify him as God, neither were they thankful, but they became vain in their thoughts, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they exchanged the glory of the imperishable God unto the likeness of perishable man, and of birds, of four-footed beasts, and creeping things. In other words, idolatry. As Paul looks back over the history of the human race, He says God has revealed himself very, very distinctly in creation. And instead of bowing down and recognizing him, humans through time, he is saying, have gone to idolatry. They have worshiped man, the birds, the four-footed beasts, and creeping things. And we can say that even today, instead of worshiping God as the creator of all things, we tend to turn and worship our own mind or our own ideas rather than recognizing the creator, and hence in the process often reject God's existence or God as the creator. I've often said that to go to the nearest galaxy, we would travel at 2.5, in other words, it's 2.5 million light years away, 180,000 miles a second, the speed of light. It would take us how long? 2.5 million years of travel time at that galaxy to get to that travel time to get to the nearest galaxy. God has revealed himself, Paul is saying, in nature, and yet we turn away from that and worship human things, idolatry. And Paul's going back to creation, what God has revealed. And that's so important, because you look at this and all the way through we see the greatness of God. If my facts are still correct, I think the earth can fit into the sun. I believe it's 1,300,000 times, which is amazing when you think about God's greatness. And even before we had that information, we could see the greatness of God in nature, Paul's saying. And the things of God from creation are clearly declaring his power and divinity. And yet, instead of worshiping him, humans have turned to idols and to worship their own, can I say, mind or thoughts or whatever, applying it to today or whatever idols we could apply today. Material things, money, all the things that take the place of adoration and worship of our Creator. Then Paul moves on in verses 24 to 27, talking about how even in the sexual area, there has been a turning away from original creation. I believe, as I'm understanding Paul. He says, wherefore God delivered them over into the lusts of their heart, to impurity, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God in the lie, and served and worshiped the creature that is above the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And so I think that what we're looking at here is the immoral history of the Gentiles, of people, of all mankind, from the beginning of time, from creation, in terms of sexual immorality. And so Paul then applies it further when he says, on account of this, God gave them over unto passions of dishonor. Their women exchanged the natural use unto that which was contrary to nature. Likewise, the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, doing that shameful deed, and the penalty which was necessary of their error in themselves receiving the penalty which was necessary from that as a result, Paul is saying, of their error in themselves. So Paul is now saying that the act of homosexual sex actually goes contrary to what God had originated at creation. It's interesting. I don't think Paul is just picking on one thing here or seeking to attack one group of people, because as we go on, he's going to list everything that's going on: immorality, all kinds of evil, violence. In other words, what he's doing, he is saying everyone is guilty. Everyone has fallen away. And he's showing idolatry followed by sexual activity. And when he talks about homosexuality, he's going back to the belief of the Jewish people very early on too, applied to homosexuality. And the context here, I think Paul is going back to creation. I believe Paul took the creation seriously in Genesis 1 and 2, that Adam was really a human being, first created human being, because he'll talk about that later, how that in Adam sin entered into the world. And I've often thought, and I've said to students, that Christ, I believe, took Adam as a real human being when he said, in the beginning, God made male and female. Or when he said that you have been killing folk from Abel to Zechariah. Zechariah, this is in Matthew 23, Zechariah being the last, can I say, martyr, so to speak, of the Hebrew Bible, and Abel the first. And I've often said, if Abel is real, or Zechariah is real, I believe Abel is real. And if Abel is real, I believe his daddy is real, Adam. So Paul's going back to creation. And in the beginning, God, we're told in Genesis, Bereshit, made male and female. And they were to become one flesh. And so I'm quoting a quote, by the way, from the New Bible Commentary, which reads as follows. This is on page 1123. Paul is seizing on homosexual practice as an example of the Gentiles moving away from God's original creation order. And when he speaks of this being unnatural, he is going back to Genesis in that context where one is practicing something different from what God had created in male and female at the beginning of creation. So this again is not to critique just one group of people. Paul's using examples here of how from the beginning, from Adam on, there's been a falling away from God's original creative intent. And I think most commentators would agree with this. And I think a lot of times people think, well, Paul's just picking on one group of people. Paul will say he's the chiefest of sinners. He was killing Christians, thinking he was doing God a favor. And so Paul is not just pointing at one thing. Also, he will also talk about fornication as he moves on. That is, any type of sex outside of marriage between a man and a woman. And so Paul would say that any sexual activity, whether it's heterosexuals living together and not being married, is not in line with God's creative order, where he joined male and female to become one flesh. So he's not just talking about one type of sexual, can I say, activity, but anything apart, I believe, from creation. He's going back to creation, from Adam and Eve, joining them together, becoming one flesh, defining the realm where sexual activity should occur. In a marriage between a man and a woman, whatever sexual activity is involved, whether heterosexual or homosexual, that sex is reserved for the marriage between male and female. Paul, I believe, would be arguing and not trying to pick on one, can I say, particular group of people at all. So then as we move on, he says, not only do we see idolatry and sexual sin, but also a long list of sins. And here we have one after another, and it includes all of us. We're all messed up, Paul's saying, as the MRI is put on. And he goes on to say, God gave them over to dishonorable passions. He let them go their own way. And then he repeats that repeatedly again to deliver over, verse 26, and then again in verse 28. And notice 28 and following, that just as they were not approving to keep God in their knowledge, God gave them over. And now we're going to go into a long list of things. So everybody is guilty. No one is without the need of God's grace, Paul is saying. And notice what he said. God gave them over unto a disqualified mind to do the things not fitting, being full of all unrighteousness, activity that is not right before God. And I would translate this next word, porneia, fornication, which means any sex outside of marriage between a man and a woman. Paul is saying that is what has happened as we look at the history of the Gentile peoples through time. And then greediness, greed. People are after money. Money drives everything. Even today, people are driven to work constantly under time clocks and everything. Why? Because of greed. And then notice he says evil, all types of evil, full of envy, that is jealousy, permeating the human heart, murder. And Jesus said, if you hate your brother, it's like as you've committed, it's as though you've committed violence in your heart. And if you look upon a woman to lust, it's the same as though you've committed adultery in your heart. So Paul's listing the guilt. And then he says, strife, humans are constantly in conflict, deceit. Through time, he said, we see constant deception, lying, not telling the truth, malice, that is meanness. Humans can be mean, Paul's saying, looking at history. Whisperers, they talk and whisper things in the ears of others about people. Slanderers, they speak down against people and ruin their character. And in Jewish sources, that's like committing one of the worst violences you could commit, is to slander someone's character. And then haters of God. They really don't love God. They hate God, Paul says. Proud. There's an arrogance, a proud, cruel. Not only proud, but cruel has been the history of humankind. Boastful, bragging, constantly bragging on themselves, the history of mankind. Inventors of evil. Think of all the evil that has been invented by humans when we look at human history. And then, not only that, but he goes on to say that we are without faith, meaning that we don't really, we're not trustworthy many times. We're found without faith and without proper, notice he goes on, without understanding of what God wants in our lives. And then untrustworthy. Again, going back to being true to our word, looking at the history of mankind. Next, he goes on, not being loving without having love, unloving. And then finally, without pity, hardcore, without pity, who knowing the judgment of God, that they who practice these things, all of these things, are worthy of death. Not only do they do them, but they approve those who practice them. So Paul says, looking at the history of the Gentile world from Adam on, there's not only disapproval of all these things that Paul has named all the way to chapter 1, but there's also approving of what goes on. And so Paul is very clear here that we're all guilty. None of us are free from the need of God's, can I say, spiritual surgery, which is done in the gospel, in what Christ has accomplished. And so this chapter is laying the foundation that we all are in trouble, spiritually speaking. I have a friend, a fellow minister, who says, he calls me bishop. I'm not a bishop, but he calls me bishop. He said, Bishop, you're messed up too. We're all messed up. It doesn't matter whether you have a THD, a PhD, a DD, or whatever you have, you're messed up. And that's true. The older I get, the more I realize that. And that's why without Christ, what would we do? Is what I think Paul's saying. And so we all have fallen short of the glory of God. That's his whole point here in chapter 1. I remember my dad one time, they were praising him for being so wonderful, and he really was. And that he, if you saw him, if you saw Carl Stats, you could see Christ. And this went on for some time. And then I'll never forget, my dad had his time to speak. And he just said a few words. And these were the words. He said, all I can say is I'm nothing. I'm a sinner, a miserable sinner, saved by God's grace. And that's what we all are. We're all sinners, saved by God's grace. That's what Paul wants us to see as he's in this chapter. And I'm reminded of the slave trader years ago, John Newton, who wrote the amazing hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less grace, no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. May we champion the grace of God, realizing, as Paul has said, we're all sinners. And that's why we need the justifying work of Christ. He'll go on now in chapter 2 in our next sermon to talk about the religious and how they're guilty as well.